I'm open to anything.
You actually mentioned like a lot of things about like the culture, the history. Does religion actually play a role in the whole like race issue, and what that role is?
I'm not actually an expert on religion at all, and there's tons of people who work on religion in Brazil, so I'm going to only briefly suggest that where religion comes into play is that it's one of these cultural practices, right? So if you associate yourself with Umbanda, Candomblé, other religions of African descent, as many as Brazilians do, of all phenotypes, right, and of all racial identities, it isn't strictly, its association with blackness, right, then sheds questions and does this, is part of that same process of reading the body, right? So the more associated you are with practices that are associated with non-whiteness and blackness, the more you throw your own whiteness into question, right? And I think that what I want to suggest is that you can talk about big practices, like do you listen to hip hop and go to rap concerts? Do you practice African religions? All of those are big practices that help people read bodies and identify them. I mean, they don't come pre-labeled, right? Bodies don't come pre-labeled, and especially in a place where there's a lot of racial mixture, right? There's a lot of ambiguity. I think even in the US context, there's plenty of ambiguity, and we react not just to phenotype, but also to the same kinds of cultural and linguistic practices. So I think on one level, I want to draw attention to that, right? How do these practices mean something? I'll give you a quick US example. When you talk about when we were back in the day of Obama, right, and we had our first black president, there was tons of signaling that was going on, right? So people asked him about his musical preference, and you could throw in his religion too, and the fact that he was affiliated with black churches, right? And there were times when he qualified those. He listened to hip hop. He made that very well known, right? But he also listened to classical music, and that was also on his playlist, right? And the fact that he was aware, right, that those cultural and linguistic practices are significant, that they send racial meaning to people, and that then they're also interactually negotiated. So my point is sort of, we need to pay attention to these cultural and linguistic practices. They're super significant to race. They're one of the most important ways we read race. It's not just phenotype. But the other thing that's interesting as a linguistic anthropologist who studies day-to-day conversation is to watch the way that gets interactionally negotiated, right? That it's not that you're one thing. In any conversation, you are constantly negotiating how you're being read based on what it is. Are you indicating an affiliation with religious practices, right? You're going to think carefully about whether you say, so, I was at this cordon bleu, right? Like, what does that say about you? And do you need to qualify that, right? The ways in which that's linguistically negotiated. One of the other things that I study in my book is the way that these youth that I hung out with, who are mostly dark-skinned, who lived in this housing project that they referred to as a shantytown, even though it's not the shantytown you're picturing up a hill. It was an actual housing project on this incredibly expensive real estate. Like they're right smack in the middle, and very aware of the surveillance and the fact that people don't believe that they deserve that land that they're occupying. They had, because they were in such accessible land as opposed to the hills, they had tons of police surveillance. And so one of the things, the linguistic practices that I look at that go in the other direction from this talk, is the ways in which they would tell stories about being stopped by police. A frequent topic of conversation. Now, I was never there, and I couldn't actually record them. Those interactions would never have gone the same if I was there anyway, right? But their stories are significant, right? For what they are remembering and thinking to tell me, especially as an outsider, is important. And one of the things that they repeatedly brought up was the way that they would speak to these cops. And the fact that the cop would stop them and they would say, boa noite, good evening. And they, in the middle of telling this story, they'd say, one of them would turn to me and be like, you always say that, you say boa noite, right? And they would explain, like, if you want to protect your body, right, and protect yourself from gratuitous beatings, which happened, they didn't get disappeared, but plenty of youth get killed and disappeared in more isolated favelas. They had the security of all eyes on them, but they could get beaten, right? You choose how you speak very carefully. And by drawing on their more standard part of the repertoire, one of the things that I talk about in the book is that people would readily associate that with class, right? They're trying to sound like they're middle class. But they're not just trying to sound like they're middle class, because being middle class means being white. And citizenship means being white, right? And getting access to citizenship rights and having the police protect you instead of harm you means being white, right? And so what are they trying to do, right? They cannot, there's limited resources that somebody has in an interaction like that, right? But language is something that you have, right? Ready. You can't change how you dress. You can't move yourself out of what is a very marginalized black space, right? And already guilty by association for criminality and violence. You can adjust your language, right? You can sound as much like a white upper class citizen as you can, and then hope that the officer responds in kind. And many of their stories were about just that, right? How they got the cops to let them go because they were polite and respectful and spoke in standard, in more standard Portuguese, and this is what got them to be treated. So I think it's those things, like talking about what are those practices that are fundamentally racialized, which religion is, which language is, right? That people know, even if they can't always articulate it clearly. Certainly with religion, they can and do. They know the racial associations. But then the ways in which those practices come up, right, in day-to-day interactions, and the ways in which even within the course of one interaction, you're trying to shift racial perceptions of who you are and what that means, right? Obama could not say that he loved hip-hop. He couldn't buy a pit bull. I give this example to my students all the time. He didn't buy a pit bull as the White House dog, right? That would be racialized black. He buys a Portuguese something, water something.
Water dog.
Water dog. I was going to say that. I was like, that can't be right. I'm not a dog person. He buys a Portuguese water dog, right? I mean, these things matter. It's not just his phenotype. He knew that. There's other people who have done work. Samuel Leem and Geneva Smitherman have written a book on Obama's language, right? And they focus more in the book about, they're interested in looking at the ways that he will signal blackness, especially depending on the audience, right? And the ways that he will code switch, right? If you're paying attention, and for the people that can read those signs. But I'm fascinated by the other side, which is that if he were speaking what is associated and known as African American English, if he was using some of the shibboleths and there are things that he could never say because the position demanded that he exude enough whiteness that white voters could read him as phenotypically black and racially white enough that he was safe, right? He couldn't, so, religion, the black church, right, turned out to be a problem, and he had to work his way around that and distance himself from it, because connections to blackness in the United States and in Brazil are inherently dangerous. And one of the things that I'm interested in is the ways that they're dangerous for white people too, right? This idea that white people just act white, right, and don't even think about it, I think is fundamentally not true. I am sure that all of you familiar with the U.S. audience listen to this rap, a song, and the story about him, and you didn't think, wow, that would never happen in the United States. There's never any moral outcry by white parents about their white teenagers listening to rap music, and right? I mean, right? White people are very afraid about losing their whiteness and not displaying sufficient whiteness. It just feels more secure in the United States, right? In Brazil, it feels very tenuous, and so I think it's a nice example to help us see that the work that goes into it, I don't think we work any less hard. I don't think white people work any less hard in this country. And religion is also here significant, right? What kind of religion you associate with.
Thank you.
You talked about speakers from the Northeast, right? I think you mentioned that. I was wondering if you looked at how this being linguistically white interacts with the geographical origin in Brazil, because I know there's lots of Northeasterns living in Rio and São Paulo. And what
so you're asking about regional and language?
Yeah, and how that gets coded into, is it white, is it not white?
Right, so this is, I think they're totally analogous and different. And whenever I try and give comparisons to the United States, I always want to be like, let me just say two things at the same time, okay? Because that's what I need to do. But because there's so many similarities and there's so many differences at the same time. So in the United States, we have this question of poor whites, right? And where they fit into whiteness, right? And the fact that class, we think that they're different according to class, but there's many ways that we can talk about racial things going on there too. In Brazil, their comparable situation is the situation of Northeasterners. And this, for so long, troubled me, because I would listen the way people talk about Northeasterners and the way that they treat Northeasterners, and they use it, it's really convenient, because even though the region is associated with blackness, many Northeasterners are actually light-skinned. And you have to invert your U.S. gaze and geography here. Okay, so you have to think, when I say Northeast, you think South. When I say South, you think Northeast, because that's the way the power, the money, the education industry is all in the south of Brazil. That's where Rio is, and that's where Sao Paulo is. And the Northeast is the stigmatized, backwards region of the country. And so for many years, it killed me that, like, you can listen to people do this. The favelas are not only filled with black people, and Brazilians see this, and they love to throw that out there to bolster their argument that, see, we're not really racist so much as we're classist. They have no problem saying that. They have no problem saying we really do discriminate against people because of their socioeconomic class. But they love to use that as the counterexample. If there are lots of people from the Northeast in favelas, and they're impoverished and in these poor areas, neighbors, then how could it be discrimination against black people? Because there's white people there too. And for years this troubled me because I knew it was not right. I knew that there was like tons of race stuff going on there. And I wanted to say, look, these people are not being treated as if they're white, right? Like their phenotype, right? Part of what I'm saying here is just not relevant to how people are understanding them. And I think the interesting thing, first of all, is to point out when you want to convince people, no, this is in fact racism, and this is about the circulation of racial ideas that have circulated for 500 years and didn't disappear anywhere overnight and will not disappear overnight. And they keep changing in convenient ways for people to be unable to recognize that we're still talking about these same racial ideas, right? You have this idea that, well, if there are light-skinned people in the favela, they know that the hierarchy, like the rich people, are all white in Brazil. They know that. But at the bottom, it's racially mixed. So how could it be about racism? If you want to prove structural racism, point one, you say, okay, so where are all the darkest skinned people? And they're all at the bottom, right? And so, you know, when I talk to undergrads or in my book too, I try to point out, like, look, that's structural racism. It doesn't matter who they're with, right? They can be with other people. You have a society that puts only the whitest people in the top and locates all of the darkest skinned people at the bottom. That is structural racism. But the other thing that helped me profoundly was Barbara Weinstein, Brazilian historian of Brazil, came out with a great book, The Color of Modernity, I think it's called. And she did this thing that I have been dancing my way around for so long. She did a great historical analysis and shows how, as the regions are developing, right, over time in Brazil, you have the white South producing itself. I mean, they're the ones importing the immigrants, right, from Europe, right? And so they're the ones with the higher concentrations of European immigration, and they are producing themselves as the white, modern center of Brazil against the backwards, northeastern, black part of Brazil, right? And so she basically comes to the same conclusion with an elegant historical demonstration of how it happens, that Northeasterners are not considered white in Brazil. They are light-skinned. They are not considered racially white. And that Sao Paulo built itself on that idea. We are white, they are not, right? They are the backwards part of the country. And it's built on all kinds of racial ideas, right? And so that's one of the things that I think, when you look at their language, so here's another part, because I think you asked specifically about their language. You get back to the same difficulty that I had. So if people will say, well, how could you say it's racism when people will discriminate against a person from the Northeast, a favela resident, just as they would a black favela resident? So then the other thing they're willing to admit to, so they do class. They're like, we got class discrimination, check. We have it. We believe, yeah, that we do that. Then they'll also tell you that they discriminate against marginalized parts of the city and favelas. They'll say that, no problem. Well, you know, favelas, there's a lot of discrimination against them. And that also works for them, right? To say, well, see, our discrimination isn't really racial. It's based on either class or where they live, right? Place of residence. But the truth is, I think this is one of the things, again, that took me so long to try and like find a way to say, and the way that I ultimately said is we have to stop putting all this attention on phenotype, because it just distracts people. It distracts people from understanding how racial ideologies work. It's not like a racial ideology says blackness is this. It's associated with lack and all negative things, and if it finds it on a light-skinned body, well then all of a sudden it's class and not race anymore, right? It is still racial ideologies, right? It talks about these inner capacities that people have, and that if you are whiter, even if you're not lighter, right, you have this capacity for education and civilization, beauty, refinement, and that is the fundamental racialized distinction. So when you're making that racialized same distinction, so when they say, so for example, all this waves of crime on the beach, this also now very contested space in Rio, that like now because of buses and all kinds of changes in infrastructure, poor, darker skinned people can access the beach. And it's flipping white people out who, that was their backyard. And you know, when you think of Ipanema and Copacabana, you don't think about dark skinned people, right? You think about white Brazilians, right? Skinny, white, very well, like, you know, in good physical shape, right? This is their idea, just as it's our global idea of who belongs on those spaces. And so they will look at me and say, well, okay, but when we get just as worried when there's a group of black kids passing by that we're going to be robbed, as this is the white middle class people that I work with, right? As we would if a bunch of northeastern kids who are clearly from favelas walk by. And their conclusion is, so it's not racism. And my conclusion is, it's still racism. You just have decided that those other signs of blackness override their skin color. They are being met as black people. They live with black people. They live in black spaces, right? They do the same menial labor jobs, right? They have the same lack of education. You offer them the same, like low, you know, you deny them the same opportunities, right, to become fully Brazilian citizens, and then, you know, judge them for that lack, right? It's the same process. It's not any different. But this is the constant. Were you a Brazilian audience, you'd be raising your hand to be like, what about Northeasterners? How can you really say it's racism if they don't have dark skin?
What I was wondering was, you know, I can see a Northeastern being able to pass as white in the Northeast by, you know, speaking a certain way. The quote-unquote standard Portuguese, whatever that comes to, you know, that means. I'm just wondering if they would be able to do that in a place like Rio, where some of their accent would still come across. I think that's,
you're talking about in terms of regional accent.
Yeah.
I mean,
if you have encountered anything like that, or
I think, first of all, if you have all of these trappings, like the language and the practices of middle class, white middle classness, your chances of success are much higher, right? You're asking, wouldn't they still hear the Northeastern accent and think and discriminate against them because of that? Possibly, but that's my point. Is it's sort of like this calculus. There's old studies in Brazil that played with this term of calculus, and I actually find it useful, right? I think that's what we do. I think we make these constant racial calculus of calculations of how white people are, how black people are, how non-white they are. I think we do it in the United States, right? I think they do it in Brazil. I think it constantly shifts. And there's fabulous examples of this. I mean, my students have tons of examples of this, right? They're light-skinned Latinas or Chicanas, and people treat them a certain way, and then they open their mouths with a Spanish accent, or they say that what their name is, or they say where their family's from, and all of a sudden people treat them differently, right? And what's happened? They didn't change, they're still light, right? But there's a racial calculation that has shifted, right? And just in the same way that any kind of things you associate yourself with can allow people to shift their calculations of you. And this is where you also will find, again, back to some of my interests in destabilizing whiteness, I do not think that white people who have light skin can walk around, or do walk around, 100% secure in their whiteness. It is different in Brazil, right? Because of the racial mixture, they have a our focus on racial purity has allowed white people to believe that they're like solidly, firmly white, right? And phenotypically they look whiter, right? Which is why my friend thinks she can't be white if I'm white, right? But it's not like we do any less of that, right? Like if you do things, so why are white parents so worried about their white kids listening to hip hop, right? If they aren't in fact worried that this could jeopardize their status in some way, right? People will read them the wrong way, right? And it doesn't have to be something so dramatic, right? Not everybody is like Bola, right? That he could be read as black. You just, again, it's not like we have categories. They're not stamped on our heads, and we don't work in like just these discrete categories when we think about race, right? Somebody being read as blacker, right, or less white, right, has an effect on how they'll be treated, right? And we know this, right? Even though we don't necessarily articulate it, and even though we are very, very wed to the idea that race is something that you physically see, and that it's obvious and clear and clear cut. So I love giving examples to my class about how Brazil helps complicate that, because it was mind-boggling for me when I first started working in Brazil, and I gave out slang surveys in the very beginning of my research, and the hardest question on the slang survey was the question for racial identification, because at the bottom I had like your age, your class, your neighborhood you lived in, your race. And the question that people come up to me that they were unsure to fill out was not in these slang terms. It was, how do they fill out the racial classification? And they did things that to my North American viewpoint like made no sense. They'd say, well, what are the options? And then they'd say, what does this option mean? They don't even know what amarelo is or supposed to be. But then they'd say things like, well, what do you think I should put down? And then they would turn to the person next to them and be like, well, what are you putting down? Right? And then they'd hold up their arms to each other. Or they'd ask these questions like that were like race is seasonal. They'd say things like, well, do you mean what race I am in the summer when I'm really dark? Or in the winter when I'm not as dark, right? And those kinds of things I think are really helpful, because they make no sense to us because we think race is so fixed and clear. But we have been trained, right, under like lots of harsh like there's been a lot of work invested in us to think that race is the way that we think of it, right? And that it has to be one or the other, right? I mean, I talk about this too with Obama, right? Like I used to ask undergrads back in the day when he was president, I could start with him as a relevant example. I'd say, okay, so our current president, is he black, white, or multiracial, or biracial? And the debate would be between whether he was black or biracial. There was nobody who was going to put that he was white, and then I have to be like, why is that so inconceivable to you, right? Like, what about that, right? Like the biracial, we can all say, okay, there's a way in which you understand that definition. But the fact that it's biracial or black is the only option, right? It shows you how clearly we've come to think about these things in very specific ways. And so I think that idea that there's more calculating that we're doing, and one of the things that's so important for me, especially when speaking to Brazilians and writing about Brazil, is to point out that yes, you're thinking about class, and yes, you're influenced by place. I'm not saying those things aren't relevant, just like I'm not saying phenotype isn't relevant. Obviously they're relevant. But there's a lot more going on there, and what Brazil, for those of us who are so fixed on phenotype is race, we need to pay attention to all those cultural practices, linguistic practices, those shifts that go on. And for those who are so wed to this isn't about race, yes it is, right? If I can point to racial ideas about whiteness and non-whiteness that have been around for hundreds of years, and I can show you that people are acting on them, it's race, right? It can't not be race. And in a country that's so racially unequal, it has to be race, or how do we explain that inequality? Like how is that still the case when slavery is even as long as it took them, right, long gone?
I wanted to ask you a little bit about your linguistic choices and how you frame it as whiteness and lightness. Why did you choose whiteness and lightness instead of blackness or darkness? And how did you come to that decision?
No, blackness and darkness I think would be, if I were going to talk about like how to classify people, I think it would be a good parallel. I was just focused a little bit more on the whiteness side of it here. The whiteness and lightness was me trying to translate that they have no terms that people recognize. I mean, whiteness is not really a person on the street kind of term. It's an academic term here too. But there they had to like sort of make terms once whiteness studies developed in the U.S. and they're trying to bring it over. I think the blackness versus darkness, the one way that I would say I do something like that in the book was that this came from a review I got on the earlier manuscript that was super helpful, where one of the reviewers totally got what I was trying to do and said, look, why you're talking about how race is so shifting and not fixed and not well-defined and not discrete categories and interactionally like derived, so negotiated too. So why are you labeling these people for us? Why are you saying black youths, right, white middle class? And so I stopped. I went through my entire manuscript, and where I was talking about individual people, I put cues as to their phenotype, because that is information that people have at their disposal when they see them, right? That they're dark-skinned. But I did not label them black, because it would be suggesting that I already knew, right? And that's my whole point, is that I don't know, they don't even, and they don't have the same fixed sense of racial identity to identify themselves in one way or the other. So I was doing a disservice to how they thought of themselves and how I thought about, I wanted people to think about race. And so it's not that I don't continue to say things like the white middle class, because I want to point out, that's a different intervention to say, stop talking about the middle class in Brazil as if it's not like fundamentally, thoroughly white and racialized. It is, right? So I would say things in general like the white middle class. But when talking about individuals, I would say things like light-skinned or brown-skinned, just so that I wasn't falling into that exact trap of telling people, look, race is negotiated, and people themselves are constantly shifting themselves, like orienting towards and away from whiteness. But I'm like sort of defeating that purpose by already predefining them and saying, but they're really black, right? Like as if that's the more significant moment, like of what they were doing. Does that?
Yeah, I was just thinking a little bit about how it's framed as whiteness or not, or less whiteness, or the loss of whiteness or perceived whiteness, and kind of that deficit language, and then how some of the language used about proper Portuguese and things like that, how that might be a challenging dynamic for you when you're writing about it. If you can speak more to that.
So the one thing, and I don't know if this is what you're getting at, so tell me if it's not, but the one thing that I think is critical, I have had people, so this talk gets some people object. I can have Brazilians object because they don't like that I'm talking about race, and I can have people from the U.S. also complain that they don't like how I'm talking about race because it's so different than we talk about race in the United States. One of the things that I often get a lot of, and then I keep saying it because I don't know, if I'm saying things that like make people upset, then maybe that's good, right? Maybe that's going in a direction we need to go, right? To push how we're thinking about these things. So one of the things that I say that can be similarly provocative is that I do focus so much on whiteness. Not only do I identify myself as somebody who works in whiteness studies, I talk a lot about whiteness, and I think it's always about whiteness. And people will say to me, really? Always about whiteness? And I will say, okay, let me rephrase. It's never not about whiteness. It's not that whiteness has to be the most critical thing that people are doing in that moment. And certainly in the US, you can see how there's tons of different racial groups playing off of each other, and there could be no white people around, right? So we have linguistic studies of Asian Americans appropriating African American English, right? You have plenty of examples, right? Situations like that. And so here I waltz in, and I can understand how it's not like for me to be like, it's always about whiteness. The point is, it's never not about whiteness, right? So when you have studies of Asian Americans taking on African American English, the point is that African American English is still judged inferior. Why? Because it's not proper. Why is it not proper? Because it's not the language that's associated with white people, right? And at the end of the day, that is what I think race is about. Like, I think you cannot boil it down. You can focus on lots of different parts of it, right? And I don't think that the focus always has to be on whiteness. But I think we need to acknowledge more and more the ways in which this is about white people, which is something that they don't like to hear in Brazil, and we similarly don't like to talk about in the United States, right? Funny that the people who talk most about white people in colorblind America are critical race scholars and critical whiteness scholars, and now white supremacists, right? These are the only people who really want to talk about white people. Everyone in the middle is kind of like, there's no, I mean, we're not I didn't do anything, right? They don't want to talk about whiteness, right? And I think race is fundamentally about whiteness. It is nowhere not about a central distinction that was made between whiteness and non-whiteness, right? And that is what it started with, and it is what the economic relations that it was meant to justify, and the property and resources flooding to white people across the globe, right, wherever they were, right? And so I think for me, focusing on whiteness is really important as a central part of what it is that people are doing. They are orienting towards whiteness and away from it. And I think that you get, for people who have studied language, you know, you can see the racial and linguistic parallels in the hierarchies, right? You define something as the standard, and then everything else is non-standard. And we talked a lot about, like, we've changed our terminology many times, right? To not say, it used to be substandard, right? Back in the day, you talked about certain varieties of English as substandard, and we got rid of dialects, and now we talk about varieties because dialect sounds inferior, right? And so we're constantly trying to, like, change our terminology to not keep that bias within the way we're talking about it. But I think there's that, which I recognize and appreciate, and then there's also the fact that we need to recognize that bias is exactly what the distinctions are about, right? The fact that standard English and standard Portuguese and proper speech are always the language associated with white people, right? And therefore, right, it is in that very definition that that's what's proper and that's what standard is, like saying whiteness, right? It's the pinnacle against what everyone else will be compared, right? And that where everyone else has to sort of orient, again, towards or away from. And I do have examples in the book where people orient away, choose, as Bola does, right, to orient away. It's not always that we push towards whiteness or feel drawn to display whiteness, but it's never not about whiteness. I kind of feel confident, and I feel like that's important to say.
I was just curious about how you view this as like a generational, as you were talking a lot about the youth and then their parents. And so I was curious about the ways that you view generational shifts as taking place, because I feel like I can see some of that from my US lens and US experiences, that there are generational shifts taking place in our society, and how you incorporate those different intersections into your work to explore not just perhaps we talk about geography and different aspects of identity, but in what
do you mean that the generation part as like a sort of progress part?
Not necessarily.
Right.
But the way that the parents were talking about their children in some deficit type ways, I think you see that a lot.
Yeah.
Across generations too, when the next generation is coming up. So I was wondering if you had explored any generational differences in your analysis.
No, not long term. I think the generational dynamic that you're talking about is super interesting to me, right? So that follow-up research that I've done, that I still have a lot that will come out of that study, is precisely about parents grooming kids, right? And so that dynamic is especially interesting to me. The ways in which who your children are, the things that they do, so like parents so keenly, especially today, and I think worldwide, but this is a specific kind of parenting moment. It wasn't always the case. Like that so keenly reflects on you, right? We're so incredibly child-centered, especially in middle class, not just America, right? Middle class globally is very child-centered, and it's so then like who the children are reflects on, you know, who the parents are. That dynamic is really interesting to me. The tricky part is that I don't think that you can talk about it as any kind of progress narrative. I think I think that fits into like what we think of as the standard. So white middle class America, like this mom, says, well, a certain amount of slang in your teenage years, it's part of the developmental narrative of you will have this rebellious, right, like to hell with the establishment and everything my parents have told you moment, as long as it like gets reincorporated and then it gets back on track, right? And that's her fear, is that this is not looking like it's going to get back on track. It's too much, right? And so I think that that part is interesting to me too. I don't have more of a generational study, and I don't think you would find. What I do have is a comparison that when I studied speech and recorded speech in the housing project and among poorer youth of color, you definitely had more dramatic slang use, and the white middle class youth were expected to only skim like the surface of that, which I think is true in the United States also. What's interesting to me in the United States is that you have a different generational thing going on where youth speech has become like corporate America cool speech, right? So the ways in which, right, you can't use African American English on a job interview. I'm actually doing a study with some undergrads of mine on the corporate appropriation of African American English and slang. So on Twitter, so that now you have companies like IHOP tweeting things like pancakes on fleek, right? And yeah, we have all this data that suggests that that doesn't change, right? They're picking up this generation because they see it as like it's a great selling point for them, and it's an image that they want to take on. It doesn't mean that you can actually go for a job interview and say things like on fleek, right? We actually had somebody post a sign from one of these chains. There's a ton of these really terrible offenders. Taco Bell does a lot of this, Chipotle. And there was a sign from one that somebody had actually tweeted out of like saying, do not, the language you cannot use, right? If you want to work here, you cannot say. And it's all the things that they're posting on their corporate Twitter accounts, right? To sound edgy and generational and appeal to youth. So I have information on that, on those components, but I don't know that that's necessarily the trajectory that you were talking about.
All right. Well, thank you all for being here. Can we give her one more round of applause?